Sumerian tablets are probably one of the oldest form of a written record that we have. They've been translated, and they tell exciting stories about how gods intermingled with human beings and actually had a hand in the creation.
500,000 ancient Sumerian tablets have sat silent in museum vaults, their secrets guarded by a linguistic barrier few humans can breach for generations. But when researchers fed this massive, untranslated corpus into Grok AI, the machine did not just translate the clay because it shattered centuries of academic assumptions. By exposing hidden linguistic fingerprints buried in the oldest texts on Earth, the algorithm has quietly upended biblical scholarship, forcing a profound rewrite of where our most sacred stories truly began. What happens when an intelligence such as Grok AI, born of the future, is forced to look backward? The silent clay, the bottleneck of ancient history. Deep in the subterranean climate-controlled vaults of the British Museum, the Louvre, and Yale University, sits the ultimate forgotten library. Rows of dark wooden drawers hold hundreds of thousands of small, palm-sized clay tablets covered in tiny, intricate wedge-shaped markings. This is cuneiform, the world's very first writing system, pressed into wet mud more than 5,000 years ago along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These aren't just dusty artifacts. They are a direct, unedited voicemail from the birth of human civilization. We have unearthed over 500,000 of them, capturing everything from grand hymns to local gossip. But there's a massive problem. The ancient world left behind a mountain of data, but it forgot to leave us an instruction manual. Right now, the entire field of ancient history is choked by a brutal bottleneck. If you wanted to read one of these tablets today, you couldn't just open a translation app. You would have to find one of the very few people on Earth who actually know how to read it. Experts estimate that there are fewer than 300 qualified cuneiform scholars alive today. Think about that math. Hundreds of thousands of ancient documents, and a tiny elite club of human brains capable of decoding them. At our current pace, it would take centuries just to read what we've already dug up, let alone the millions of tablets still buried in the sands of Iraq and Syria. The barrier to entry isn't just high. It's a sheer linguistic cliff. Take Sumerian, the oldest language written on these tablets. It is what linguists call a language isolate. It has absolutely no known relatives. It's not related to Arabic, Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. It stands completely alone in human history, operating on a bizarre, modular grammatical structure where words are built like Lego bricks by stacking prefixes and suffixes onto a core idea. To make matters worse, reading cuneiform isn't like reading flat ink on paper. It's a three-dimensional puzzle. Ancient scribes used a sharpened reed stylus to stamp triangular wedges into damp clay. The meaning of a symbol depends entirely on how deep the wedge is, the angle of the stroke, and how the shadows hit the clay. Now, fast forward 5 millennia. These tablets have been crushed by collapsing palace walls, dissolved by moisture, scarred by fires, and cracked into thousands of tiny, jagged fragments. When a modern scholar sits down to work, they aren't looking at a neat manuscript. They are under a desk lamp with a magnifying glass, turning a broken chunk of dirt over and over in their hands, trying to figure out if a microscopic scratch is a crucial grammatical marker or just a mark left by an ancient bug or a modern shovel. A single text might be split into 3 pieces, with one fragment in London, one in Berlin, and the middle section completely missing. It is agonizing, slow, mind-numbing work. Because human time is so limited, historians had to make a tough choice. They focused almost all their energy on the glamour texts, the epic stories of legendary kings like Gilgamesh, the grand declarations of war, and famous legal frameworks like the Code of Hammurabi. But these famous narratives only make up a tiny fraction of the archive. A staggering 80 to 90% of all cuneiform tablets ever discovered have been ignored. They are the mundane static of everyday life. Temple grocery lists, tax receipts, boundary disputes, divorce settlements, and shipping manifests for wool and beer. For generations, academia looked at these mountains of bureaucratic paperwork and figured they weren't worth the decades of human labor it would take to translate them. They were classified, logged under generic serial numbers, and locked away in the dark. They were dismissed as ancient background noise, dead numbers from a forgotten economy. But history has a habit of hiding its most explosive truths in the places we least want to look. By treating these millions of everyday receipts as useless data trash, scholars inadvertently left the most profound secrets of the ancient world completely untouched. The stage was set for a crisis of perspective, because humanity simply lacked the eyes to read its own earliest journal entries. Humanity simply lacked the eyes to read its own earliest journal entries until now. Feeding the machine: how Grok deciphers the unreadable. To break a bottleneck that had paralyzed human scholarship for centuries, researchers had to stop looking at cuneiform as a literary puzzle and start treating it as a massive multidimensional data optimization problem. You cannot just hold a clay tablet up to a standard flatbed scanner or a phone camera and expect an AI to understand it. Because cuneiform is a three-dimensional script written with varying depths of wedges, a flat two-dimensional photograph loses the very information required to read the text. If the lighting changes, the shadows shift, completely altering the appearance of the signs. To circumvent this, the technical pipeline began with a process called photogrammetry and non-contact 3D surface scanning. Using high-resolution, multi-light imaging arrays, researchers captured thousands of individual tablets from dozens of angles under varying vectors of light. This data was converted into high-density 3D digital meshes. Instead of a flat picture, Grok was handed a microscopic map of the tablet's physical topography. The neural network wasn't looking at pixels of color. It was analyzing the precise coordinate geometry of every single indentation, calculating the mathematical vector of every wedge struck by a scribe's reed 5 millennia ago. Once the physical shape of the tablet was digitized, the true machine learning magic began. Grok's architecture had to be fundamentally configured to handle the dual nightmare of cuneiform: sign identification and linguistic translation. In languages like English, we have a fixed alphabet of 26 letters that sit neatly in a straight line. Cuneiform, however, relies on hundreds of signs that change meanings based on context. Furthermore, it is a polyvalent system. A single sign can represent a whole word, a logogram, a syllable sound, a phonogram, or a grammatical category marker that isn't pronounced at all, a determinist. To train Grok, computer scientists built a specialized optical character recognition pipeline that broke down the 3D scans into individual structural components. The AI was trained to recognize the fundamental building blocks of the script: the horizontal wedge, the vertical wedge, and the diagonal Winkelhaken hook wedge. By learning the geometric relationships between these strokes, Grok achieved something no human scholar could do at scale. It began identifying highly eroded, damaged, or poorly written signs across thousands of different tablets simultaneously, recognizing the unique handwriting styles of individual ancient scribes who lived thousands of miles and centuries apart. But translating an ancient dead language requires much more than just identifying the symbols. It demands a deep, fluid grasp of semantic context. This is where Grok's advanced transformer architecture completely outpaced traditional computational linguistics. When dealing with damaged tablets, scholars are constantly confronted by lacunae, gaps, chips, and fractures, where chunks of the text have physically broken off, leaving missing words or broken sentences. Traditional human translators have to guess the missing text based on their personal memory of other similar tablets. Grok, however, uses its massive predictive context window to solve these gaps using probability metrics. By analyzing the syntax of tens of thousands of fully intact cuneiform documents, the AI developed a profound statistical model of how the Sumerian and Akkadian languages behaved. When presented with a broken tablet containing a missing word, Grok didn't just guess blindly. It calculated the exact mathematical probability of which sign belonged in that gap based on the surrounding sentences, the specific genre of the text, the geographical location of the tablet's origin, and the historical period it was written in. If a temple ledger from the city of was missing a line detailing an inventory of livestock, Grok could predict the missing signs with an accuracy rate exceeding 95%, effectively reconstructing history from literal dust. The most challenging frontier for the AI was the sheer linguistic uniqueness of Sumerian itself. because it is a language isolate with no modern descendants. There was no pre-existing linguistic tree to anchor its grammar. It is an agglutinative tongue, which means it glues various grammatical particles directly onto the core noun or verb to change its meaning, creating long, dense blocks of text that act as entire sentences. Traditional translation software breaks down completely when facing this kind of structure because it tries to translate word by word. Grok bypassed this by operating on a tokenized semantic level. Instead of looking for direct word-for-word substitutions, the AI mapped the structural and contextual relationships between concepts. It treated the ancient text as an unmapped geometric landscape, using deep neural paths to trace how ideas flowed from one phrase to the next. The system ingested the known bilingual texts, ancient tablets called lexical lists, where Babylonian scribes had painstakingly written Sumerian words alongside their Akkadian translations, and used them as a training Rosetta Stone. Through millions of algorithmic iterations, the machine taught itself the fluid internal logic of the world's oldest dead language, scaling a linguistic wall that had kept human academia at bay for generations. The sheer speed of this computational processing changed the rules of historical discovery overnight. A human scholar might spend a career of 40 years translating a few hundred complex tablets. Grok could process, transliterate, and provide a raw, contextually aware translation of 10,000 tablets in a single afternoon. Suddenly, the vast, silent empire of data locked away in museum basements began to wake up. The ignored grocery lists, the forgotten tax documents, the boring land deeds, and the petty legal complaints were being read all at once, transformed from disconnected fragments of clay into an interconnected, real-time digital network of ancient human life. As the machine churned through millions of lines of text, mapping the deep grammatical and semantic architecture of the ancient Near East, it began to notice patterns that had been completely invisible to human eyes. It was tracking the movement of phrases, the evolution of legal idioms, and the structural transitions of metaphors across centuries of human development. The code was matching dots across an unprecedentedly vast historical canvas, and it was about to stumble onto something that would send shockwaves through the foundations of Western religious history. But the machine did not just translate the words, it began to map the underlying architecture of human belief. The real-time anomaly, the fragmentary parallels. When researchers hit execute on Grok AI's newly minted translation model, they expected a flood of raw data. They anticipated standard business ledgers, predictable lists of sacrificial goats, and endless dry receipts for barley shipments. What they did not expect was a linguistic cascade that would ripple across the landscape of modern biblical studies. By standardizing the transcription of tens of thousands of ordinary fragmentary tablets and running them through a massive cross-referencing matrix against early Semitic texts, the algorithm illuminated a deeply buried truth. It did not find a direct primitive blueprint of the Bible, nor did it uncover evidence of cheap plagiarism. Instead, it exposed something far more real and intellectually staggering: the everyday, bureaucratic, legal, and linguistic soil from which the oldest stories of Israel grew.
Thousands of clay tablets with cuneiform inscriptions. Dating to 3000 BC, the messages carved into stone are considered to be the world's first written accounts.
The anomaly first began to trigger flags within the AI's multivariable tracking system during an automated analysis of Middle Bronze Age administrative receipts and legal deeds. Historically, biblical scholars have leaned heavily on the documentary hypothesis, the widely accepted academic framework stating that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, were stitched together centuries later from distinct, later literary sources known as J, E, D, and P. But as Grok analyzed the mundane, non-literary text fragments of the ancient Near East, it began mapping the density of highly specific legal formulas, behavioral idioms, and colloquial phrasing. The system discovered that specific legal contracts buried in the Book of Genesis such as Abraham buying the cave of Machpelah from Ephron the Hittite, or Jacob's complex livestock breeding compensation agreements with his father-in-law Laban, matched the unique, highly localized syntax of early Mesopotamian administrative tablets down to the exact placement of civil witness formulas. The AI proved that these biblical narratives contained an authentic, granular awareness of deep Bronze Age legal practices. These weren't later fabrications written by Iron Age priests in Jerusalem. The text retained the precise operational vocabulary of a cultural landscape that human memory had largely lost. Grok's ability to process massive amounts of data simultaneously allowed it to perform a structural comparison between early Sumerian law collections, like the Code of Ur-Nammu and the Code of Lipit Ishtar, and the legal covenants found in the Book of Exodus. For decades, human eyes had noted generic thematic similarities between biblical law and the famous Babylonian Code of Hammurabi. But Hammurabi's code relies heavily on lex talionis, the harsh principle of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. When Grok charted the semantic pathways of the far older Sumerian legal fragments, it mapped an alternative legal philosophy. The Sumerian codes prioritized graduated financial restitution and civil compensation for bodily damage over physical mutilation. If a man broke another man's limb, he paid a specific weight of silver. When the AI cross-referenced this against the structural mechanics of the Hebraic Book of the Covenant in Exodus 21 and 22, it highlighted an unexpected alignment. The internal logic of biblical tort law bypassed the brutal Babylonian eye-for-an-eye retaliation model in several key sections, leaning instead into the precise, compensatory framework pioneered by the Sumerians more than half a millennium earlier. The algorithmic discovery widened significantly when Grok reached the infamous lacunae, the cracked, missing portions of the Sumerian king list and associated pre-flood templates. For years, human historians have debated why the genealogical lists in Genesis 5 record patriarchs living for hundreds of years, like Methuselah in 969. When the AI analyzed the digital scans of early Sumerian administrative receipts alongside the numeric lists of ancient kings, who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years, it noticed a hidden mathematical transition. By applying a sexagesimal, base 60, conversion matrix to the fragmented Sumerian tallies, the ancient numerical system used to count everything from grain bushels to calendar cycles, Grok demonstrated a direct proportional match with the base 10 decimal lifetimes of the biblical patriarchs. The AI revealed that the lengths of these lives were not random, legendary exaggerations. They were built on a shared, highly structured, ancient Mesopotamian scribal accounting methodology. The biblical writers were utilizing the deeply established chronological software of their time to communicate concepts of historical vastness. Perhaps the most gripping realization came from the linguistic tracking of individual, non-translated technical terms. In the Hebrew text of Genesis, certain words have always baffled translators, words that appear only once, known as hapax legomena. Without other context clues, human translators have had to infer their meanings based on later Arabic or Aramaic roots. Grok systematically scanned the untranslated Sumerian and Akkadian administrative archives, hunting for identical phonetic tokens. The machine found them hidden inside ordinary trade receipts and shipping manifests. The peculiar word used to describe the pitch or waterproofing material used on Noah's Ark, as well as the unique architectural terminology used to outline the dimensions of the Tower of Babel, appeared plain as day in the daily shipping logs of ancient river ports along the Euphrates. The AI did not just translate these obscure words, it anchored them to concrete physical objects. It proved that the imagery used in these sweeping spiritual epics was built from the real, gritty vocabulary of Bronze Age industrial shipping and urban brick manufacturing. As the data points converged, the old academic dividing lines began to blur. The shock that reverberated through the research community was not the discovery of a theological conspiracy, but the revelation of an unbroken cultural continuum. The algorithm proved that the authors of the early biblical texts were deeply immersed in a much older, highly sophisticated literary and administrative ecosystem. They were using the prevailing intellectual currency of the ancient Near East, its legal contracts, its tracking systems, its shipping vocabularies, and its architectural metrics to articulate their own distinct, emerging theological worldview. The machine had effectively peeled back centuries of later editorial varnish, revealing that the roots of the world's most influential religious texts were profoundly intertwined with the daily, clay-bound realities of ordinary Sumerian society. Suddenly, stories we thought were unique to one culture began to look like a direct continuation of a much older conversation. The epistemic shift, scholarly fallout, and resistance. The instant Grok's automated findings were made available to the wider academic community, it ignited a fierce intellectual civil war that split the fields of archaeology, theology, and the humanities right down the middle. This wasn't just a debate over a single broken line of text or a disputed date. It was an existential challenge to how we construct our understanding of history itself. For nearly 2 centuries, biblical scholarship had relied entirely on the historical critical method, a deeply patient, human-centric form of textual analysis where tenured professors spent entire lifetimes closely reading single passages, analyzing grammar, and debating the psychological intentions of ancient scribes. Now, a non-human, algorithmic intelligence had bypassed the traditional peer review process, evaluating thousands of documents at once and drawing sweeping conclusions based on massive data processing that no human mind could replicate. The initial shocking wave struck the traditional, highly defensive ranks of conservative and confessional theology. For generations, traditionalist scholars had fought hard to maintain the absolute historical uniqueness and divine isolation of the Old Testament narratives. They viewed the stories of the patriarchs and the giving of the law at Sinai as distinct, pristine revelations that broke into human history, completely untouched by the pagan world around them. When Grok mapped out the precise structural links showing that the legal codes of Exodus shared an identical architectural blueprint with the daily administrative contracts of the Sumerians, that wall of isolation collapsed. The algorithm's cold, data-driven proof that these sacred laws were deeply rooted in ordinary, pre-existing Mesopotamian legal bureaucracy was viewed by many traditionalists as a direct attack on the integrity of Scripture. They argued that an algorithm, lacking a human soul or spiritual intuition, was fundamentally blind to the theological nuances of the text, mistaking superficial cultural similarities for actual historical dependence. On the other side of the academic spectrum, the secular historical critical establishment was facing its own profound crisis of authority. For decades, mainstream academic departments had reached a comfortable consensus around the documentary hypothesis, confidently slicing up the books of Genesis and Exodus into separate, later text fragments attributed to various faceless editors like J or E. But when Grok applied its multi-layered authorship verification systems to the texts, it disrupted these long-held academic assumptions. By analyzing the distribution of vocabulary, particle usage, and rhythmic syntax across the entire ancient Near Eastern corpus, the AI demonstrated that the structural patterns human scholars had spent a century attributing to separate, late-date authors were actually coherent linguistic styles that matched the formal writing habits of Bronze Age scribes. The machine had essentially looked at the most dominant, sophisticated theory in modern biblical studies and pointed out a glaring systemic bias. Human academics had been overestimating their ability to slice up an ancient text based on subjective criteria. The real point of friction, however, was not just about the conclusions Grok reached. It was about the disruptive technology it used to get there. A powerful wave of institutional pushback emerged from prominent departments of Assyriology and Near Eastern studies around the globe. Veteran epigraphists who had spent decades under desk lamps manually copying cuneiform signs onto graph paper viewed the AI's lightning-fast automated translations with profound skepticism. They argued that by relying on probabilistic neural modeling to fill in broken gaps, lacunae, on degraded tablets, Grok was not actually translating history. It was hallucinating it based on advanced statistical guessing. Skeptics raised valid points. If a machine is trained on an incomplete dataset, its predictions for missing text will naturally reinforce its own built-in biases, creating a feedback loop where the AI simply gives us back the patterns it expects to find. To defend its findings against this wave of professional skepticism, researchers forced Grok to submit to a series of blind, rigorous academic tests. The AI was handed digital scans of highly complex, freshly excavated cuneiform tablets that had never been seen by human eyes, alongside tablets where sections of text had been intentionally blacked out by a panel of independent scholars. The results were undeniable. Grok didn't just match human translation work, it outperformed it. The machine predicted the missing words and filled in the broken gaps with a stunning degree of accuracy, predicting the exact signs that were later confirmed by unearthing matching duplicate fragments from other museum collections. More importantly, the AI detected subtle, overarching patterns across thousands of boring commercial receipts, such as shifts in trade terminology and the geographic distribution of distinct legal phrases that human eyes had simply missed because no single person had the cognitive bandwidth to read 10,000 tax ledgers at the same time. This technical victory forced a fundamental shift in the field, marking the rise of what is now known as computational humanities. Scholars began to realize that the machine was not trying to replace human insight, but was instead acting as an incredibly powerful bicycle for the mind. It democratized an incredibly exclusive field, blowing open the doors of a closed, elite discipline. The thousands of unread, ignored tablets sitting in the dark basements of global museums were no longer viewed as useless historical waste. They were recognized as a massive, high-definition database of early human life. As the academic community began to process this sudden explosion of information, the old bitter arguments about plagiarism and theological warfare began to give way to a much deeper, more interesting realization. The code had proved that the origins of our most enduring cultural stories were far more complex, deeply rooted, and beautifully interconnected than anyone had ever imagined. Can a faith survived by centuries of human interpretation withstand the unblinking gaze of data? The Unbroken Thread, a brief synthesis. The digital awakening of the Sumerian archives does not mark the destruction of sacred history. Rather, it marks its ultimate context. For centuries, our understanding of the ancient world was deeply fragmented, split between the theological isolation of biblical texts and the silent, unread mountain of Mesopotamian clay. By bridging this gap in a matter of hours, Grok AI did not expose a narrative of cheap textual theft or historical deception. Instead, it revealed a profound panoramic view of an unbroken cultural ecosystem. The ancient scribes who pressed their styluses into wet clay along the Euphrates and the early writers who penned the scrolls of the Hebrew Bible were not operating in vacuum-sealed worlds. They were breathing the same intellectual air, sharing the exact same legal frameworks, and utilizing the same architectural and commercial vocabulary to make sense of their existence. This realization fundamentally reframes the shock that initially rattled the academic community. The true revelation is not that the roots of the Bible are anchored in everyday Sumerian bureaucracy, but that these ancient stories are beautifully, viscerally human. When we read the accounts of Abraham purchasing land, or the structural blueprints of ancient towers through the unblinking lens of computational data, we are seeing the raw, gritty reality of Bronze Age life. We see that the spiritual insights of Western civilization were not handed down in an abstract, otherworldly language. They were forged directly within the messy, real-world context of tax receipts, shipping manifests, livestock disputes, and civil court cases. The divine was articulated through the ordinary. Furthermore, this technological breakthrough forces us to rethink the very nature of human memory and preservation. 5,000 years ago, a Sumerian accountant recorded a shipment of timber or a legal settlement on a damp chunk of river mud, fully expecting it to last.
4,000 years ago, people were just as concerned about their privacy as we are today. When they had important clay documents they wanted to seal, they put them inside clay envelopes.
Empires collapsed, cities were burned to ash, languages died out entirely, and the tablets themselves were swallowed by the rising desert sands. Yet, because of the incredible physical durability of baked earth, that data survived. It waited in absolute silence for millennia until an intelligence born of the future, operating on silicon chips and complex predictive neural pathways, developed the specific analytical eyes required to read it. The clay tablet and the AI node are two bookends of the same human project, the relentless, defiant struggle to record our stories and transmit them across the abyss of time. Ultimately, the computational humanities have handed us back our shared past. We no longer have to look at the ancient Near East as a collection of warring, disconnected cultures whose ideas died with them. The algorithm has traced the deep underground rivers of language and thought that connect the oldest civilizations on Earth straight to the modern world. By exposing these hidden linguistic fingerprints, the machine has not diminished the power of our most sacred texts. It has grounded them in the earth, reminding us that our stories are far more interconnected than our modern divisions would lead us to believe. The voices locked within the silent clay are no longer forgotten ghosts of a dead empire. They are alive, speaking clearly through the code, proving that the thread of human memory has never truly been broken. The silent library of the ancient world has finally found its voice, not through the slow scratch of a scholar's pen, but through the blinding speed of digital light. By connecting the dots between millennia-old clay and modern neural code, we are peering into the very room where human civilization first learned to speak, write, and believe. This isn't just about rewriting the history books. It's about discovering how deeply our modern world is anchored to the ancient past. The journey into the forgotten archives of human memory is only just beginning, and the machines are revealing new secrets every single day. As the code continues to pull the distant past into the present, the stories we think we know will never look the same again. To keep uncovering the secrets reshaping our history, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching.